I was running a calibration check on the atmospheric scrubbers when she walked in. That's the honest truth. I wasn't watching the docking bay for anything interesting. I wasn't expecting anything interesting. Veth Station had been boring for 11 consecutive rotations, the kind of boring where you start counting the condensation drips on the cooling pipes just to feel something. I had 43 drips cataloged. I had names for some of them. So yeah, I was doing my job. Doing it slowly, doing it quietly, the way you do when the shift has 7 more hours left and nothing is going to happen and you know it. Then the bay doors opened, and the intake logs on my panel lit up like a fire alarm. Diplomatic Registry, sealed clearance, Aldorian House of 7th Passage. Priority tier, Amber. I looked up. She came through first, Ambassador Sevethlian of the Aldorian Collective, third daughter of the High Passage Council, which if you know anything about Aldorian politics means she's important enough to matter, but young enough that nobody's tried to assassinate her yet. She was tall even by Aldorian standards, which is saying something because Aldorians are already about a head and a half taller than most species in this sector. Blue-gray skin, those long ridgelines running from temple to collarbone that Aldorians develop when they reach political maturity. She wore a traveling coat in deep violet with silver threading at the collar, understated by Aldorian standards, which in galactic terms still looked like something out of a pre-contact historical archive about royalty. She was beautiful in the way that very powerful, very composed people sometimes are. Not warm, not approachable, just precise. Like someone had built her specifically to be exactly as impressive as necessary. Behind her came 4 Aldorian functionaries, 2 of them carrying equipment cases, one holding a data slate, one doing absolutely nothing except existing as backup status symbol. Standard escort configuration for an Aldorian of her rank. And then, behind all of them, came the human. I almost missed him. That's the thing about humans that nobody warns you about when you're stationed somewhere like Veth. They don't announce themselves the way other species do. An Aldorian enters a room and you feel it. There's a particular way their environmental suits pressurize that makes a soft sound right before the door opens. And then they're tall and they're blue-gray, and they take up space in a way that your peripheral vision registers immediately. A Kethali enters a room, and you smell the mineral salts they secrete when they're in unfamiliar environments. A Vreth 7 enters a room, and your inner ear picks up their subsonic navigation pulses, even if you're not consciously listening. Humans just walk in, no tell, no announcement. One moment they're not there, next moment they are. He was medium height by human standards, which made him shorter than everyone else in the party. Dark hair, kept close. Skin that suggested a lot of time outdoors somewhere with significant UV exposure. He was wearing a close-fit security uniform, not Aldorian style. Their security personnel tended towards ceremonial armor, but something practical and dark and specifically designed, I would later realize to not draw attention. He had a bag over one shoulder, one of those human carry sacks, worn and patched at the strap. It looked completely out of place. He was looking at the ceiling when he walked in, not in a distracted way, in a professional way. Checking sight lines, exits, structural irregularities. I'd seen security personnel do that kind of assessment before. I'd never seen someone do it while also looking completely bored. His eyes came down, and for just a moment they crossed mine through the observation window. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, just filed me away in whatever mental database he kept and moved on to cataloging the next thing. I pulled up the roster on my panel. He was listed under Diplomatic Security Attachment. Name, Rael Morrow. Species, human. Deathworld classification, not listed, which meant whoever had filled out his intake form either didn't know or didn't think it was relevant. That should have been my first clue. Deathworld classifications are standard intake procedure. You don't just forget to list one. You either don't know what you're dealing with, or you know exactly what you're dealing with and you've decided, for whatever reason, not to write it down. I filed it away. I went back to my drip counting. 3 hours later, someone tried to kill the ambassador, and everything changed. Let me back up a little, because if I just jump to that part, you'll miss the pieces that matter. The pieces that explain why what happened the way it did. Veth Station sits at the intersection of 3 trade corridors, the Aldorian Passage, the Kethali Meridian, and what most species call the Old Road, which is ancient enough that nobody agrees on who built it or why. but everyone uses it because it goes where they need to go. This makes Veth the kind of place where you get interesting combinations of people, sometimes interesting in the good way, more often interesting in the way that keeps security personnel employed. I'd been here 2 years. I worked atmospheric systems, scrubbers, pressure regulation, emergency sealing protocols. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary work. And on a station this size, necessary work keeps you humble because you're very aware of all the ways the thing keeping you alive could stop working if you stopped paying attention. The station administrator at the time was a Kethali named Prithosal. Good administrator, methodical, the kind of person who documented everything, which on a station means you always know exactly what you missed and exactly why it mattered. He was the one who briefed us on the ambassador's arrival, called the entire day shift into the main hub, and stood at the front with his data slate and told us, in that precise way Kethali have of presenting information, exactly why this visit mattered and exactly how we were supposed to behave. Ambassador Sivethlian was here to negotiate the 7th Passage Trade Compact. The compact had been in negotiation for 6 years. It affected cargo transit rights for 11 species, with specific provisions for extraction rights in the Pelid Corridor, which was a region of space that contained, among other things, resources that 3 different species had been quietly positioning themselves to claim for the last decade and a half. This is not a routine diplomatic visit, Prithosal said. He had a way of stating things that made you feel the weight of them. The ambassador's presence here represents a critical juncture in negotiations that have significant implications for regional trade stability. You will behave professionally, you will assist her delegation where assistance is appropriate, and you will not, he looked at the maintenance crew specifically, which I admit was warranted based on some previous incidents I won't get into, cause any incidents. He did not mention the human. He mentioned the Aldorian security contingent. He mentioned the station's own security personnel and the protocols for their coordination. He mentioned the ambassador's specific environmental requirements. Aldorians run slightly cooler than Veth Station's standard settings, which meant I'd spend the next 72 hours adjusting airflow in 3 sections of the guest wing. He did not mention Rail Morrow at all. I found that interesting enough to actually ask about it afterward when most of the staff had filtered out. I caught Prithosal at the door. Administrator, the intake manifest lists a human as part of the security attachment. That's unusual for an Aldorian delegation. Is there anything we should know about? He is the ambassador's personal bodyguard, Prithosal said. He has been with her delegation for 8 months. He is a contractual attachment, not an Aldorian citizen, and the ambassador has specifically requested that he not be the subject of administrative inquiries. I wasn't. He will require standard human-compatible accommodations. Everything else has been handled at the clearance level above ours. Prithosal looked at me with the particular expression Kethali use when they have said everything they intend to say on a subject. Adjust the airflow in sections 12 through 14. She needs it 2 degrees cooler. I adjusted the airflow. I did not ask more questions. For about 48 hours, nothing remarkable happened. The ambassador established herself in the guest quarters and held 4 separate meetings with station representatives and the advance envoy from the Kethali side of the trade negotiations. I know this because the atmospheric adjustments required for each meeting were different. Kethali breathe fine in standard air, but they prefer slightly elevated nitrogen percentages when they're in prolonged meetings, something about their cognitive processing, and each adjustment request came through my console with timestamps and room designations. I caught glimpses of the diplomatic proceedings the way station maintenance personnel always catch glimpses of things. From the outside, through windows and partially open doors, while doing some entirely unrelated task nearby. The ambassador was compelling in person. That's the honest word for it. She moved through spaces like she owned them, but not in a careless way, in a way that suggested she had thought about the ownership and concluded it was simply factual, not worth making a performance of. She spoke galactic standard with an accent that made it sound like she was doing the language a favor by using it. When she listened the way people listen when they've been trained to notice exactly what isn't being said. Rail Morrow was always in the room, always toward the back or positioned at a door or standing just inside a corner where the sight lines from the entrance were cleanest. He said nothing during the meetings. He held nothing. He just existed in the space with a quality of attention that I started to notice the third time I had reason to be in the corridor outside. The other security personnel, the Aldorian ones, had a different quality of presence. They were alert in the formal way, straight posture, eyes moving on a regular pattern, hands near their sidearms. Trained alertness. The kind you learn and practice until it becomes automatic. Rael's alertness was different. It wasn't performed. It wasn't patterned. It was just there. Constant and quiet, the way background radiation is constant and quiet, something you only really measure when you have the instruments for it. On the second evening, I was running a check on the pressure seals in Corridor 7, which ran along the back wall of the guest wing, when I heard voices through the ventilation grill. I wasn't eavesdropping. I want to be clear about that. I was doing my job. The ventilation grills are part of the atmospheric system, and I had a diagnostic running, and the sound happened to carry. I heard the ambassador's voice first, speaking in Aldorian, which I understand about 40% of, enough to get the shape of a conversation without the specifics. Then I heard a second voice, quieter, speaking Galactic Standard with the flat vowels of someone who learned it from a tutor rather than from growing up in it. Not the schedule I'd recommend. A pause. The Cathali envoy has requested a substation tour for the third day. It would mean traversing 3 unsecured corridors. Another pause. The ambassador said something. I understand the diplomatic value. I'm telling you the security value is negative. There's no way to pre-clear those corridors without tipping the schedule to anyone monitoring our movements, and given the signal's intel from the last port. The ambassador said something longer this time. Yes, ambassador, I understand. Silence. Then I'll find another way to route it. I finished my diagnostic. I sealed the grill. I went back to my station. I thought about that phrase, signals intel from the last port, for a while. Then I filed it away. The attempt happened on the morning of the third day. I say attempt because that's what the official report called it eventually. In the moment, I didn't know what to call it. In the moment, I was 3 corridors away running an emergency pressure check because one of my scrubber nodes had flagged a microleak in Section 11, which was annoying but routine, and I was focused on that. What I knew in the moment, a sound that wasn't an alarm and wasn't machinery, something sharp and brief, followed almost immediately by the alarm that it triggered. I've heard people describe the sound of a weapon's discharge on a station before. Most species who have done shifts in contested space know what it sounds like. It's not like the entertainments make it sound, it's not dramatic. It's actually kind of small, sharp, and contained. The alarming part is always the silence right after it, the moment where your body is waiting to find out what it means. That morning on Veth Station, the silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then I heard something else, something I didn't have a word for at first. I cataloged it later after I'd talked to people who were in the room. It was the sound of a human in motion. Not running, not charging, something in between but controlled, purposeful. Then more sounds, then the secondary alarm. Then, for approximately 11 seconds, nothing at all. Then the emergency channel on my panel lit up and Prithosel's voice came through, and he said 4 words in the precise, weight-loaded way he said everything. Corridor 9 is secure. I didn't get the full picture until much later. Pieces of it came from different sources, the official incident report, which I accessed through maintenance clearance because atmospheric systems feed into emergency logs. A conversation with Tyrus, one of the Aldorian functionaries who'd been in the room, and a longer, strange conversation with Rael Morrow himself, 3 days after the incident, which I'll get to. What had happened? The ambassador had been meeting with one of the station's senior trade liaisons, of Vreth 7 named Koselev, in the secondary conference room in Corridor 9. This was a scheduled meeting, logged on the official calendar. Rael Morrow had flagged the scheduling as a security concern the previous evening, because the secondary conference room had 2 doors, and the second door opened onto a maintenance junction, and the maintenance junction connected to 3 other corridors. His recommendation: move the meeting to the primary conference room, which had 1 entrance and a view of the main corridor. The ambassador had declined. The Vreth 7 had specifically requested the secondary room because of its acoustic properties. Vreth 7 have sensitive hearing, and the primary room sat adjacent to a cargo hub with significant ambient noise. So Rael had done the next thing. He'd arrived 2 hours early and walked every inch of the maintenance junction himself. This is a detail I want to emphasize because I think it matters. 2 hours before the meeting. Not 15 minutes, not half an hour, 2 hours. I asked him about this later. He shrugged in that particular way humans have, where one shoulder comes up slightly and the gesture means something slightly different depending on the person. Junction had 9 junction points, he said. Each one takes about 8 minutes to properly assess. 9 times 8 is 72 minutes, plus transit time, plus margin. You calculated it. It's what I do. Back to the morning of the 3rd day. The meeting had been in progress for 40 minutes. Rail was positioned at the primary door, the one visible to the corridor, as standard. The secondary door was closed and latched from the inside, which is what security personnel do when they can't cover both entrances simultaneously. What Rail had not mentioned to the ambassador, because he didn't have certainty and he operated on the principle that you don't create alarm without certainty. During his 2-hour pre-assessment of the maintenance junction, he had found something that wasn't quite right about the secondary junction point directly adjacent to the conference room's back door. A seam in the panel that was slightly misaligned. Not enough to flag definitively. Enough to note. He had noted it. 40 minutes into the meeting, the seam he'd noted moved. He was across the room before the panel had finished opening. The official report describes what happened next in the flat, clinical language of incident documentation. I'm going to tell you what Tyrus told me, because Tyrus was standing 3 feet from the ambassador and was not, at that moment, capable of clinical detachment. He was just there, Tyrus told me. We were in the station cafeteria. Tyrus was holding a cup of warming fluid that had long since gone cold. One moment he was at the door, the next moment he was at the back wall. He moved through the room in that time. Tyrus set down the cup. I don't know if moved is the right word. He covered the room. There were people between him and the door and they were just no longer in his path. I don't know how. I was watching it happen and I don't know how. The panel had opened. 2 individuals had come through, species unclear. The report listed them as unknown modification profile, which means they'd had enough biological work done that standard biometric identification was difficult. They were armed. They were armed, and they were moving toward the ambassador, and Rail Morrow met them at the panel opening. He used the door, Tyra said. The panel, it was still in motion. He used the edge of it. He hit one of them with the panel itself, I think, and the other one. Tyra stopped. The other one tried to use their weapon. I waited. It didn't work the way they expected, Tyra said. He took it from them, I'm not sure exactly how. It was fast, very fast. And then he had it and they didn't, and then he contained them. Contained? That's the word the report uses. Is that what actually happened? Tyrus looked at the cold cup for a moment. He was not loud about it, Tyrus said finally. That was the strangest part. I've seen security personnel respond to threats before. There's usually something. Shouting or dramatic movement or the energy of the space changes in a way you feel. He was very quiet. He dealt with them the way someone deals with an administrative problem, methodically. And when it was done, the room was quiet, and he was standing there, and he looked at the ambassador, and he said, "The Corridor 9 exit is now compromised. I'd like to move you to Section 14 within the next 3 minutes if that's acceptable." Tyrus looked at me, and the ambassador said yes, Tyra said. That's the other part. She said yes immediately. She didn't ask questions, she didn't take time to compose herself, she just said yes. And I realized she'd seen this before, this wasn't the first time. Part 2, what the station learned. After an incident like that, a station like Veth goes through a particular kind of collective process. It's not formal. It's not organized. It happens in corridors and cafeterias and during shift overlaps in the natural way that information moves through closed communities. What the station learned about Rail Morrow happened in pieces, over the 72 hours following the incident. I want to tell you how those pieces came together, because they didn't arrive in a logical order. They arrived the way truth usually arrives in my experience. Sideways, incomplete, in a sequence that doesn't make obvious sense until you have enough of them. The first piece came from Osek, one of our security personnel who had the misfortune of being the first responder to Corridor 9 after the alarm. Osek is a Pelid 7, stocky, tough species, excellent sensory processing, not someone who gets easily rattled. Osek had responded to at least a dozen serious incidents on Veth in the 4 years I'd known her. She came to find me specifically to tell me this. I don't know why she chose me. I think maybe she needed to tell someone who hadn't already heard a version of it. He met me at the corridor entrance, she said. Morrow. Yes, he'd heard my approach. I was running, I wasn't quiet, and he'd stepped out of the room to intercept me. She paused. He showed me his credentials before I'd gotten mine out. Security protocol. Yes, but he showed me mine too. I looked at her. My credentials, she said. He already had my identification badge on his display. He'd pulled my profile, my security clearance, my on-shift assignment, everything, in the time between the alarm triggering and me arriving at the corridor, which was maybe 45 seconds. I thought about this. He had access to station personnel files. He had access to station personnel files, she confirmed, which is a Tier 3 clearance function, and he's listed as diplomatic attachment, which is Tier 2. Someone has manually elevated his access, and it's not listed on any roster I can find. You looked. I looked, she folded her arms. He had my profile. He verified who I was, confirmed my assignment, confirmed my security clearance, and then briefed me on the situation in a specific sequence. First the status of the ambassador, then the status of the detainees, then the compromised access point, then what he needed from our security team in the next 5 minutes. And it was the most organized incident briefing I have ever received from anyone, ever, in 11 years of security work. She said this last part with a quality in her voice that I can only describe as reluctant admiration. Like she was reporting a fact she'd rather not be reporting. What was his composure like? I asked. Osek considered this. Normal, she said. That's what I can't explain, completely normal. He just physically engaged with 2 armed individuals in a confined space, and his voice was completely level. His hands were still. I thought about the assessment I'd made when he walked into the station, the quality of his alertness. Did you ask him anything about his background? I tried, Osek said. He answered every question I had about the incident. Anything about his personal background he redirected politely, but completely. She unfolded her arms. His left forearm is prosthetic. I noticed it during the briefing. Good prosthetic, you'd only see it if you know what you're looking at, which I do. It moves in the full range, but there's a slight delay in the secondary grip response, couple of milliseconds. The kind of delay you get with neural integration prosthetics when the original nerve path was damaged. You can tell that from watching someone talk to you. I can tell that from watching someone's hands while they talk to me, yes. She looked at me steadily. I've processed a lot of incident reports in this job. I have certain skills. Right, sorry. The delay is very small, she said. But it tells you something. That's not an old injury. The nerve path damage that creates that delay profile doesn't happen from accidents. It happens from specific types of trauma. I let that sit for a moment. The prosthetic itself is high-grade, she added. Not military surplus, custom integrated. The kind of thing that gets done when someone wants full function restored and has access to the resources to do it right. She left without saying anything else. She didn't need to. I had enough pieces now to start assembling something, even if the shape wasn't clear yet. The second piece came from Dreva. Dreva ran the station's small commissary, food and goods, the kind of place where people from 6 different species could find something that approximated what they needed to eat and drink without their systems staging a protest. Dreva is Atreth, and Atreth have a quality that other species sometimes mistake for nosiness, but is actually a sophisticated social processing mechanism. They pay attention to everything, and they remember everything, and they naturally integrate information from multiple sources into coherent narratives. Dreva had been serving the diplomatic delegation their meals for 3 days. She came to find me during my lunch break on the day after the incident. You're human, she said, setting a bowl of something warm and approximately soup-like in front of me. He's not my human. The human with the ambassador's party, he eats strange. I looked up from the soup. Strange how? He doesn't eat anything prepared, only sealed rations he brought with him. Or things I make in front of him from raw components where he can see every step. I thought about this, security precaution. That's what I assumed, but it's not just that. She leaned on the counter slightly. Atreth have a particular posture they adopt when they're about to tell you something they've had to think through carefully. He knows what everything is, every ingredient. I've been doing this work for 16 years, and I've had maybe 20 customers who could correctly identify every component in my prep stock on site. He did it in less than a rotation, without being briefed. He could have looked it up. I thought that too, so I tested him. I pulled out something I get from a specific supplier who processes it in a way that changes the visual profile, looks different from the standard form. He identified it immediately and told me the processing method. How would he know that? That's what I'm saying, she straightened up. He knows what things are, specifically, not encyclopedically. He didn't know everything. There were 2 items in my stock he didn't recognize at all, and he was very upfront about not knowing them. But the things he knew with a kind of specificity that you only get from direct experience with those things. She paused. He also knew which of my foods he personally couldn't eat. Allergens. Compatibility issues. He has a modified metabolic profile. I could tell from the questions he asked when he was evaluating what he could safely consume. Modified either by biology or by intervention, I can't tell which. Is that common in humans? Dreva made a gesture that meant something like I've thought about this more than is probably warranted. It's more common in humans who have spent extended periods in environments that aren't human standard, long deployments in different atmospheric mixes, sustained exposure to different gravity profiles, certain types of physical modification programs. She let that hang in the air between us. He's very polite, she added as if this were relevant. Very specific with his thank yous. He doesn't treat my work like a transaction. He treats it like, she considered, like he's been in situations where he was grateful for food and he hasn't forgotten what that felt like. The third piece came from Mayan. Mayan was not a station resident. Mayan was a traveling physician who'd been on Veth for about 2 weeks, waiting for a connecting transit to the outer Pelid stations where she worked. She was Aldorian herself, which meant she'd been somewhat interested in the ambassador's visit, and she'd been in the corridor adjacent to the guest wing when the incident occurred. She found me because she'd seen me talking to Osek, and apparently decided that I was a person who was collecting information. She was not wrong. I spoke with him, she said, she meant Rail, afterward, when they moved the ambassador to Section 14. I was in the corridor, and I assisted with some of the post-incident assessment. You're a physician. Emergency medicine, yes, I've worked conflict zones, she said this matter-of-factly. I know what combat trauma looks like, both in the people who inflict it and the people who experience it. She sat down across from me at the table I'd claimed in the back corner of the cafeteria. The 2 individuals who came through the access panel, she said. They were alive when security took them in. I want to be clear about that. He could have, in that situation, with that level of threat, a different person might have made different choices about what level of force was necessary. But he didn't. She folded her hands on the table. I examined them briefly before security took them. He'd incapacitated them very precisely, not brutally, precisely. There's a difference. She paused. The injuries were educational. They suggested a very specific knowledge of how to end a physical confrontation quickly with minimal permanent damage. That's a difficult skill to develop. Most species don't develop it because they don't think about it that way. They think about threat elimination. He was thinking about something more precise than that. What's the precision for? Questions, she said. You can't interrogate someone who's dead. You also can't interrogate someone who's in enough pain that their cognitive function is compromised. If you want information from someone you've just had to physically engage, you need them alive, minimally injured, and able to think. She looked at me. He was thinking about that during the engagement, which means he was thinking about the larger strategic picture while physically managing a threat, simultaneously. I absorbed this. I also noticed his breathing pattern when I spoke with him afterward, she said. Standard post-engagement response in most species involves elevated respiration, cardiac acceleration, secondary stress hormone release. You see it even in trained security personnel. It's a normal biological response to threat engagement. And in him. Elevated, she said, but not significantly, well within normal conversational range. By the time I spoke with him, maybe 2 minutes after the incident, he was breathing like someone who just finished a moderate exercise routine. Is that unusual for humans? She looked at me. It's unusual for anyone. I've worked with human medical cases for 6 years. The range of variation in human stress responses is wider than most species. They're highly adaptable physiologically. But what he was showing was at the far end of that range. She paused. I asked him very directly whether he was experiencing any physiological effects from the engagement. Whether he needed any medical attention. What did he say? He said he was fine, thank you. And then he asked me if I'd had a chance to assess the ambassador and whether she was experiencing any trauma symptoms and whether there were any members of the delegation who might need attention. She looked at me steadily. He prioritized everyone else in the room, immediately, before I'd even finished the question about himself. She stood up. I've worked with security personnel in conflict zones, she said again. Some of the very good ones, the ones who are good at what they do in ways that go beyond training, they have a particular quality. It's not aggression and it's not fearlessness. It's something more like purposefulness. They've made a decision about what they're there to do, and every other consideration organizes itself around that decision. She picked up her things. He has that quality. It's quite distinct. She left. I sat in the back corner of the cafeteria for a long time after that. Part 3, the conversation. I debated whether to seek him out. It didn't feel like my place. I'm an atmospheric systems technician. My job is the air. The air had nothing to do with any of this. But I kept thinking about what each person had told me and the picture they were assembling, and I had this feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you're looking at a pressure diagnostic, and the numbers don't quite add up to what they should, that there was still a piece missing. Some central thing that would make the rest of it cohere. So on the evening of the 4th day after the incident, I found him in Corridor 16. He was there because Corridor 16 runs along the outer hull, and there are a series of observation panels, not proper windows, just sections where the hull material thins and becomes translucent, that look out into open space. He was standing at one of them, not doing anything, just looking out. I had a legitimate reason to be there. One of my pressure nodes was in Section 16C, and I'd gotten a minor flag on my diagnostic panel. But I want to be honest with you. I would have found a reason to be there anyway. He heard me coming. I'd gotten quieter about my approach after Osek told me about the Corridor 9 incident. I didn't want him to think he was being snuck up on, but I was still making enough noise that a person who wasn't paying attention might not notice. He noticed. His posture shifted very slightly, the kind of shift that means I know you're there without turning around. The pressure node is 3 sections that way, he said, but I'm guessing you knew that. I stopped walking, transparent. I don't mean it as a criticism. He was still looking at the stars. I'd want to understand the situation too if I were you. I came to stand at the observation panel next to him, not too close. He didn't seem to mind. The stars outside Veth Station are different from the stars in a lot of places I've worked. This part of the galaxy is on the edge of a dense stellar nursery, a region where new stars are forming from the accumulated mass of old ones, and the light in that section of space has a particular quality, pink and diffuse at the edges, the nebula stuff spreading into the black like spilled pigment. It's beautiful in a very impersonal way, the kind of beautiful that doesn't require your approval. She didn't know, I said finally. He was quiet for a moment. The ambassador. She didn't know about your Deathworld classification when she hired you. Another pause, then she knew I was human. That's not the same thing. He looked at me then. It was the first time I'd had his full attention in the direct sense. Before, I'd been something to be assessed and filed, the way you assess and file everything. Now he was actually looking at me. No, he said, it's not. How did she find out? He turned back to the stars. There was an incident at the previous port. Different situation. Someone tried to approach her in a public space and I had to redirect them. He paused. A Cathalia attaché who witnessed it looked up my species classification afterward and sent the information to the ambassador's staff. Her chief of protocol came to me the next morning and asked for clarification. What did you tell them? The truth, that Deathworld classification isn't a monolith. That what it means on Earth depends on where you're from, what kind of work you've done, what kind of life you've had. That the classification system was created by galactic survey teams who spent about 3 weeks on Earth before concluding that the entire planet qualified as a hostile environment for non-Earth species, which is accurate. but which doesn't tell you much about specific humans. What did they say to that? They asked me for my service record. He was quiet for a moment. I gave them the parts that weren't sealed. And the parts that were sealed. No answer, which was an answer. How long have you been doing this? I asked. Protective work, 8 years. 2 years contracted to Galactic Transit Security. 3 years independent. 3 years with the Aldorian Diplomatic Service. Why protective work? He considered this question for longer than I expected. Because I'm good at it, he said, and because the thing that makes me good at it. He stopped. What? Most species, when they experience a threat, their primary processing goes into the threat. The threat is the focus. Everything else is secondary. He looked at the stars. I don't process threats that way. The threat is already incorporated by the time I'm aware I'm processing it. What my brain is actually focused on is everything around the threat, all the other variables. The environment, the people, the exit routes. Yes, and the ambassador specifically. Always the ambassador. He paused. I'm aware that this is not universal among humans. It came from a particular set of experiences. Some of them were not voluntary. I thought about Mayan's description of the prosthetic forearm, the specific type of trauma. I won't ask about that, I said. I know, he was quiet for a moment. I know that everyone on this station has been talking about what happened. I know what the information trail looks like. I'm not trying to be opaque about it. I just don't find the Deathworld conversation particularly useful most of the time. Why not? Because the question people are really asking when they ask about Deathworld classification isn't really a question about biology or environment. They're asking whether I'm dangerous. And the answer to that is, he paused, it depends on what you mean by dangerous and what you mean by to whom. I let that sit for a moment. Then, the ambassador, she trusts you. Yes. Completely. He was quiet for a beat. She trusts me to do what I'm there to do, completely. Whether she trusts me personally in the fuller sense, that's a more complicated question. She's Aldorian. The full trust things take a long time. But she was comfortable with you after the Cathalia attaché looked up your classification. She asked me that morning whether I'd told her everything relevant about my background that she needed to know for her security. And I told her yes. Was that true? A very small pause. I told her the things that were relevant to her security. Yes. I looked at the nebula, at the soft spilled pigment edges of the stellar nursery, all those new stars forming in the pinklit dark. What is it, I asked, actually like? Being human, being from a Deathworld. I know the galactic survey classifications, I know the biological rundown, but what does it actually feel like from the inside? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed very slightly, still level, still controlled. But there was something in it that hadn't been there before, something unguarded. It's normal, he said. That's the honest answer. It's completely normal from the inside. You grow up with the gravity and the weather and the other things sharing your environment, and none of it feels like a Deathworld because it's just home. The thing that's strange is coming out here, and finding out that every other species in the galaxy had the sense to evolve somewhere less hostile. I found myself smiling at that. But the things that shaped how I move through the world, he continued, the things that shaped how I process threats and how I prioritize and how I think about protection, those came from specific experiences, not from the general fact of being human. Other humans would respond differently in the situations I've been in. He paused. Some of them did respond differently in situations I was in alongside them. What do you mean? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. I mean that the thing about coming from a Deathworld is that the Deathworld has a way of selecting. Over time, in specific circumstances, the people who are still standing after a certain amount of time in certain environments, there are things they have in common, not biological things, not always, just how they think, how they process the cost of things. He turned away from the stars. That's a very abstract way of saying something specific. I don't know how to make it less abstract without making it more personal than I want to make it. It's fine, I said. I got the shape of it. He nodded once. The silence, I said. After the incident, Tyrus said the room went very quiet, the ambassador went very quiet, the Aldorian staff went very quiet. Yes. What was that silence? He looked at the observation panel. When something unexpected happens at a high enough level of intensity, he said slowly, most intelligent species go through a moment of recalibration. Their internal model of the world has just been updated with new information, and they need a moment to integrate it. He paused. The silence is that moment, the moment of integration. What were they integrating? He was quiet. Me, he said, they were integrating me. Part 4, the ALDORIAN functionary. The day before the delegation departed, I had a longer conversation with Tyrus. Tyrus had by then done some integrating of their own. They'd gone from the shell-shocked cafeteria version, cold cup, thousand-yard stare, to something more composed. Not comfortable exactly, but more organized. We ended up in the same corridor by coincidence, which on a station this size happens more than you'd expect, and Tyrus stopped me. "You've been talking to people," they said. "I'm a curious person. You're an atmospheric technician. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Tyrus made a gesture that in Aldorian body language means something between fair point and I give up. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you haven't told me already." They stood for a moment thinking. "She is not afraid of him," Tyrus said. "I want to be clear about that because I think the story that's going to spread through this station is going to emphasize the threat side of things, what he's capable of, how he moved through that room, and all of that is real and I won't minimize it." Tyrus paused. "But the thing I keep coming back to is the moment after, when the room had gone quiet and he was standing there, and the ambassador." They stopped. "What did she do?" "She said his name," Tyrus said. "Not ambassador to guard, not diplomat to employee. She said his name and she asked if he was hurt." I let that sit. "He told her he wasn't, and then he did the thing with the security assessment and moving her to Section 14. Tyrus looked at me. "But she asked. That was the first thing she said after everything had gone quiet. Not what happened, not is it safe now, not any of the questions you'd expect from someone in her position. She said his name and she asked if he was hurt." "And was he?" "He said no, I think probably no, or close to no." Tyrus paused. "He has a very high threshold. I've seen him in minor situations on this trip, where something would give most people pause and he just processes it and moves. I think his threshold for what registers as injury has been set by experiences that would be extraordinary by most standards." Osek said the same thing, essentially. "Osek's very sharp." Tyrus folded their arms, an Aldorian gesture that means thinking rather than defensiveness. "When she first retained him, I was not enthusiastic, for the reason you're probably imagining, the Deathworld thing, but also just humans are strange. They're very strange up close. They experience things very directly in a way that other species sometimes find uncomfortable. Their humor arrives unexpectedly. Their emotional processing is very visible." "And now?" Tyrus was quiet. "Now I think the strangeness is connected to the thing that makes him good at what he does," they said. "His directness, his ability to be fully present in a situation without the filtering that most of us apply. When something is dangerous, he knows it's dangerous and he responds. When it's over, and he moves to the next thing. He doesn't," Tyrus searched for the word, "compound it. He doesn't layer anxiety about the next situation onto the processing of the current one." "Is that a human trait in general?" "I don't know enough humans to say I know him." They unfolded their arms. "He's unusual even for a human, I think. The other humans I've encountered, again, small sample, carry more visible weight. They show you what they're carrying, he doesn't show you." "Where do you think the weight goes?" Tyrus looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. "I think it goes into the work," they said. "I think he converted it at some point, into process, into methodology, into the 2 hours he spent checking the maintenance junction before our meeting." They paused. "That's my theory. I'm an administrator, not a psychologist." "I want to tell you about one more thing that happened before the delegation left, because I think it's the thing that made the whole experience cohere for me. The piece I'd been missing. The morning of departure, I was running the final atmospheric calibration for the docking bay, returning everything to standard settings, the way you always do when a diplomatic delegation leaves and the section they occupied goes back to regular use. It's a routine task. I was doing it methodically, the way I do everything, working through the nodes in order. I was at node 12 when I heard footsteps in the bay area. Early for the departure, The delegation wasn't scheduled to board for another hour. Rail Morrow was in the docking bay alone. He had his bag over one shoulder, which told me he'd already checked the party's equipment and was satisfied with it. He was doing one final walk of the bay. Not because he'd found anything wrong. I understood this watching him. He'd checked it already. He was checking it again because that was how he worked. Because the cost of a missed detail was something he'd calculated and found unacceptable. He moved through the bay with a quality of attention that I'd been trying to name for days and still hadn't quite gotten. It wasn't hypervigilance. That's a word that implies anxiety, and he didn't seem anxious. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't readiness in the performative sense. I think the closest I can get is, it was like watching someone who was completely present. Fully, unreservedly present in the space they were in, with everything they were and everything they'd experienced, devoted to understanding that specific space at that specific moment. He went around the full perimeter of the bay. He checked the docking clamps. He looked at the atmospheric ceiling lines, mine, the ones I was currently calibrating, and he looked at them with the kind of attention that suggested he'd learned enough about atmospheric systems to have an opinion about what he was seeing. Then he came to where I was standing and stopped. "Node 12, he said. "The calibration's running a few degrees low on the secondary flush cycle." I looked at my panel. He was right. By about 4 degrees, which was within acceptable range but would have bothered me when I noticed it at node 13. "Good catch," I said. "Your system, not mine." Still, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the docking bay. The ship that would take the delegation was already connected to the bay. A mid-size Aldorian diplomatic transport. Clean lines. No visible armament, but the right mass distribution for embedded systems. "Thank you," he said. Not to me specifically, or maybe to me specifically, I wasn't sure. "For what?" He paused. "For asking questions and not making them into a problem." I thought about what that meant. About what it might mean to be the person other people make into a problem. The thing you don't tell anyone about because it changes how they look at you, or how they expect you to behave, or what they think you are versus what you actually are. "It's a good thing," I said. "What you do, the way you do it." He looked at me. "I mean, I know that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I mean the specific way you do it. The 2 hours before the meeting. The way you thought about the detainees and what information they might have. The way your first question for the physician was about everyone else." I paused. "I've met a lot of security personnel in a lot of different configurations in the years I've been doing station work. I know what the job looks like when someone treats it as a job. This is different." He was quiet for a long time. "She's worth protecting," he said finally. "Not in a, I'm not saying it's personal, it's professional. I mean that what she's here to accomplish, the trade negotiations, the compact, if those go well, they're meaningful for a lot of species in this region. If they go badly, it's not just trade rights that suffer. There are extraction disputes in the Pelid corridor that have been close to military escalation for 15 years. The compact is one of the few frameworks that might hold them in diplomatic space." He looked at the ship. "She understands that. She's very clear about what she's doing and why and what the cost of failure would be. That kind of clarity, it's worth protecting." I nodded. "And she's good at it," he added, quieter. "She's very good at what she does, that part's." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Part 5 after. They left on schedule. The docking bay cleared. The atmospheric systems went back to standard settings. I cataloged my drips and started on a new rotation. I talked to Osek a few days later. She'd finished her incident report and submitted it. She told me, with the particular careful neutrality of someone who has recently had their professional categories challenged and is still working out what to do with that she'd added a note to the station's diplomatic security assessment framework. A note about humans with specific training profiles and how they differed from the general Deathworld classification. She said she was going to look into the classification system more broadly. That there was a gap between the galactic survey methodology, 3 weeks on Earth, measure the atmospheric toxicity and the predator density and the geological instability, apply the classification, and what you actually needed to know about a specific human in a specific context. She was right. There was a gap. There's always a gap between what a classification system captures and what's actually true about the thing it's classifying. Mayan left the station a week later, heading for the outer Pelid stations, and whatever emergency medicine waited for her there. She left a note in the station's medical log. I saw it because our atmospheric system health overlaps with the station medical monitoring. That said something like, clinical note on human stress response post-engagement. Further research warranted on variants within Deathworld classified species, with particular attention to trained and conditioned profiles versus general population baseline. Dreva added 3 new items to the commissary that were human-compatible, not because she expected more humans anytime soon, but, as she told me when I pointed this out, because if there was going to be a next time, she wanted to be prepared. Tyrus, I don't know about Tyrus. The delegation went on to the next stage of negotiations, and I lost track of the story there. But I thought about all of it for a long time afterward. Here is what I kept coming back to. The silence in the room. Tyrus had described it. Osek had mentioned it. Even Mayan, when she talked about the 2 minutes immediately after the incident, had alluded to it, a quality of quiet that had settled over everything. I'd asked Rael what the silence was, and he'd said it was integration, a moment of incorporating new information into an existing model of the world. I think that's true. I think that's a good description of what silence is in that context. But I also think there's something else in it, something he didn't say or maybe didn't think to say because it was too internal to articulate clearly. I think the silence was the moment when everyone in that room stopped seeing what they'd expected to see when they looked at him. The medium-height human with the worn bag and the unobtrusive uniform, and the eyes that filed everything away, and started seeing what was actually there. Not a threat, not a weapon, not a Deathworld classification walking around in a humanoid shape. Something more specific than that, more complicated than that. A person who had taken the specific and particular and difficult facts of his life and organized them into a purpose. Who had found something worth protecting and protected it. Who checked maintenance junctions for 2 hours and calculated sight lines the moment he entered a room and asked the physician about everyone else before himself. A person who looked at the stars through an observation panel and said, with that very small piece of unguardedness in his otherwise level voice, that home was normal from the inside. Of course, the room went quiet. What else do you do when your model of the world updates that significantly? You need a moment. You need a moment to integrate the fact that the universe is bigger and stranger, and more specific than you thought it was. That somewhere in the history of a Deathworld, there was a specific series of events that produced a specific person who would, on an ordinary third morning of a diplomatic visit, move through a room faster than the room's other occupants could track, and make a decision in that fraction of a second about precision versus efficiency, about the value of information over the convenience of finality, and get it right. You need a moment to integrate that. I needed several days, if I'm being honest. And then I went back to my pressure nodes and my drip counting and the quiet work of keeping the air right on a station at the edge of a stellar nursery, where the light comes in soft and pink through the observation panels, and new stars are always forming in the dark. Some weeks after the delegation had left, Administrator Prithosel called me into his office for a routine check-in. Somewhere near the end of the meeting, it was mostly procedural stuff, inventory logs, a pending upgrade to Section 9's scrubber array. He pulled up the incident report and looked at it for a moment. You spoke with Mr. Morrow, he said. I did. Off the record, what was your assessment? I thought about the 2 hours, the precise incapacitation, the breathing pattern, the way he'd said her name, the way he'd looked at the stars. He's very good at what he does, I said. Prithosel nodded. Once, in that particular Cathali way, that means the statement has been received and is being integrated into a larger model. The Deathworld classification, I said. You didn't include it on his intake form. He was quiet for a moment. The classification was listed in the clearance-level documents, he said, which were not accessible to station general staff. I made a judgment call about what was relevant to include in the public intake log. Because including it would have changed how people treated him. Because including it would have changed how people treated him before they had any information beyond the classification, he said. The classification tells you very little about a specific person. I've found, in my time in station administration, that leading with a classification tends to close down observation rather than opening it up. People see the category rather than the individual. I thought about this. Was that a unilateral decision? I asked. It was a decision I made in coordination with the ambassador's office, who had the same concern. He looked at me steadily. They wanted him to be seen for what he was, not for what a category said he might be. They thought, correctly, I think, based on the accounts I've received, that what he actually was would speak for itself. I sat with that for a moment. It did, I said. Yes, said Prithosol, it did. Final page, the room that remembered. There's a version of this story that ends with the dramatic moment, the panel opening, the precise movement, the silence that followed. That version isn't wrong. That moment happened and it mattered. But that's not where I think the story actually ends. I think it ends in Corridor 16, at the observation panel in the dark before departure, with a man who'd grown up on a Deathworld and learned, the hard way and the specific way, how to turn the things the Deathworld had given him into something purposeful. Who stood in the diffuse pink light of a stellar nursery and said without drama that home was normal from the inside. I think it ends with OSEC updating the classification framework, with Dreva stocking the human-compatible items, with Mayan's clinical note, with Tyrus saying she asked if he was hurt. I think it ends with a room that went silent, and then filled up again with the kind of information that changes your model of the world. That's where most things end if you're paying attention, not in the moment of crisis. In the moment after, when the quiet comes and the integration starts, and you begin to understand what you actually just saw. A medium-height human with a worn bag and a prosthetic arm and eyes that cataloged everything, and a habit of arriving 2 hours early, standing in a stellar nursery light at the edge of a trade corridor, protecting someone because the work mattered, and she was worth protecting, and he was, very precisely, the right person to do it. The room went silent, because some things, when you finally see them clearly, leave you without words, not from shock or fear, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of a world that is stranger and more specific and more full of quiet purpose than you knew. The stars kept forming in the dark, and the air, as it always does, kept circulating. Clean and correct and perfectly calibrated. The way good work always is.